Our next speaker is David Luke, talking about psychedelic-induced synaesthesia and what he found in 5 studies.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Carol. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I don't need to ask hands up if you can't hear me. That never works anyway. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I haven't been to a NUX event. I did give a talk about this research when we first started it 12 years ago, and we talked about it at Oxford. But I haven't been back to a synaesthesia conference since, unfortunately. But we have done 5 studies on psychedelic-induced synaesthesia, or psychedelic-induced synaesthesia-like experiences. And I'm going to try and give you a kind of very condensed overview of 12 years of research in 18 minutes. So you can do the maths. And add in some historical context as well. So anyway, I'm David Luke, and this is with my co-author, Devon Terhune, who can't be here today. So the first recorded account of any kind of drug-induced synaesthesia goes back to the French poet from the Club de Hachins, and you can probably guess it from the name, but he was experimenting with hashish, and he reported having a kind of synesthetic-like experience under the influence. But it kind of languished for a while, and then in the 1920s, Heinrich Kluwer was experimenting with peyote cactus, which contains mescaline, which is a psychedelic substance, and he wrote this kind of rather brilliant book, which was kind of like a pioneering book in the study of cognitive psychology of psychedelics, if you like. And Kluwer also identified, the first person to identify what we call form constants, these geometric patterns, which are really very kind of prevalent in altered states, particularly psychedelic experiences, but you get them in other altered states, such as hypnagogia, though not very often, but meditation, even occasionally hypnosis, and so on. And he identified these particular shapes and noticed that some of his participants, under the influence of mescaline, were having quite exotic forms of synesthesia. And I say exotic, I mean all synesthesia is exotic in a way, but maybe not to you, in that often they were quite complex. So people are having sensory experience induced in one sense modality, but experiencing it in 4 or 5 other modalities simultaneously. So a little bit unlike the usual kind of synesthesia, but often those usual kinds of one inducer, one other sensory experience as well. And some research began in the 1930s trying to experimentally induce synesthesia in the lab as well. The 1940s, this man here, Albert Hofmann, was a Swiss chemist working in a laboratory trying to find medicines from ergot fungus, accidentally, some say, ingested some LSD-25, shortly after became beatified. And so this was the first ever recorded LSD experience in 1943. And he actually recounts having this experience of kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. Standard psychedelic experience, really. But it was particularly remarkable how every acoustic perception, such as the sound of a door handle or a passing automobile, became transformed into optical perceptions. Every sound generated a vividly changing image with its own consistent form and colour. It's interesting you're saying it's consistent, because that's one of the hallmark features of synesthesia, that these images stay the same over time. Unfortunately, with psychedelics, these images, well, I say unfortunately, they are fleeting, and so they don't tend to last. And so some research taking interest in LSD as a particular way of inducing possible synesthetic experiences, and we also started seeing the phenomena occurring in the anthropological literature as well, such as among the Shipibo-Canibo people of Peru, who make use of this hallucinogenic beverage called ayahuasca. And they make these, as do many indigenous communities around the world, make these fantastic artwork. In this came from yarn, and they nearly always depict these kind of geometric patterns, particularly if they have a proclivity to take psychedelics in their particular culture. But in the case of the Shipibo, they say that this is what the shaman's songs look like. It's not so much What they sound like is what they look like. So the women under the influence of the ayahuasca will weave the songs that they can see. So having a kind of sound, vision, kind of synesthetic experience. And so there have been a few experimental attempts, and so I'll get to our first study. Myself and my colleague Devon decided to first of all start off by doing a systematic review of the literature to see what research had been done. It's something that, as psychedelics become more popular in the academy in the last few years, scientists will talk about, oh yes, it induces synesthesia, but no one had done any research on it since the 1960s. So we did a systematic review of the literature. We found several dozen papers which looked at it. Most of the experimental attempts to induce synesthesia were from between the 1930s and 1960s. There hadn't been any active studies done since then. There was a few case studies just reporting people had had the experience, and there were a few kind of incidental studies. So people administering psychedelics in the lab, and one of the questions on their psychometric measures would be, did you have the experience of synesthesia? And so we looked to try and kind of consolidate all those different studies and see which types of inducer concurrent synesthesia were the most prevalent, the most common, and it turns out that sound vision synesthesia, seeing sounds, seem to be the most common, although this isn't kind of a fair random selection. You know, there may be some biases in that. So we figured the next step was to perhaps explore the landscape in a bit more detail, and we did a large-scale, as large scale as we could, survey of people who took psychedelics and also of people who had synesthesia and had, sorry, not just psychedelics, in fact any psychoactive drug. So we looked at people who had taken psychoactive drugs and those people who didn't have synesthesia and those people who did have synesthesia and also had taken psychoactive drugs to see which substances were the ones most likely to induce synesthesia, what kinds, whether or not it's different amongst synesthetes and non-synesthetes, and so on. And we get these really lovely colourful graphs. And it turns out that, as was often said in the 1960s, that LSD was the one substance to most reliably induce the experience of synesthesia. So the bold colours are those people who don't have synesthesia, but do report having the experience of it under those particular kinds of drugs, the percentages of those people. So up to 58%, I think it was, of people who have taken LSD report having the experience of synesthesia. And of course, things like tobacco and alcohol and caffeine, probably fortunately, don't tend to induce those kinds of experiences, although they are more commonly used than LSD, generally speaking. And those, the shaded out bars are the experiences reported by people who have synesthesia inducing novel experiences of synesthesia. So you may have kind of graphene colour synesthetes having the experience of seeing sounds under the influence of psychedelics. Curiously though, what we found is that those drugs which tend to induce synesthesia in people who don't have it also seem to enhance synesthesia in people who do. So people reported feeling that their pre-existing synesthesia was kind of amplified under the influence of these particular types of drugs, and the psychedelics were this class of drugs which were the most likely to either induce or amplify synesthetic experiences. So we thought there was some consistency here. There's something particular about psychedelic substances. They tend to work on the same serotonergic receptor system in the brain, so we figured it might give us some insights into the underlying neurobiology of synesthesia. But we were also interested in the idea of, well, wouldn't it be fascinating if, LSD induced you to see sounds, but Salvia divinorum, a potent psychedelic plant from Mexico, kind of made you taste shapes. So it would be great if it was that specific. Turns out it wasn't the case. They tended to kind of just amplify or induce synesthesia quite generally. There was nothing drug-specific about the type of synesthesias that were being induced. And the most prevalent type, by far and away, was sound vision kind of types of synesthesia. Either sound colours, sound shape, sound space, or sometimes all three combined, often with these geometric patterns. And curiously though, we did get at least one person reported having graphene colour synaesthesia, which we might not expect for a couple of reasons. Because grapheme colour synaesthesia is probably developmental in some way, in that it's developed over time. We're not born knowing what graphemes are, what numbers or letters are, so it's kind of developmental. And also that people don't tend to try and read when they're on LSD, we noticed as well, so it's usually quite troublesome. So that might be part of a confound in there as well. Anyway, I'm going to give you some of the kind of qualitative accounts we got from that survey. We had over 1,600 people start the survey, but only about 600 finished it, unfortunately. Probably because some of them misunderstood what we were asking. Tell us about your experiences of synaesthesia on drugs. And at least one person reported that they were on drugs at the time of trying to fill in the survey. So turns out LSD is great for inducing synaesthesia-like experiences, but not very good for completing surveys. But here are some of the accounts. I doubted it, this is with LSD, I doubted it more at first than less. That live, possibly improvised music, which developed the texture of a falling strand of honey, which responded with drop clops, that's not a real word, I don't think, of whip, corresponding to the tonal characteristics, the pitch and volume of each note as it was played. I guess you could file it under seeing music, and this is by far one of the most prevalent experiences, which makes you wonder why psychedelics and psychedelic rock music and trance and rave and all the rest of it kind of seem to have gone well together. Particularly a lot of these early 1960s bands who were experimenting with psychedelics also experimented with trying to recreate the synesthetic experience and having light and music shows. Particularly one famous band called the Grateful Dead. I don't know if you've heard of them. It turns out their sound engineer was the world's biggest underground illegal LSD manufacturer. And he sometimes combined his two kind of hobbies, interests, careers, whatever you might call it. And on one occasion he was checking the sound levels for the band, doing the kind of the sound check. And he saw the music coming out of the speakers, and he was like, oh wow, So instead of kind of doing the sound levels by what it sounded like, he did it by what it looked like, even moving the position of the speakers, which might say a lot about the Grateful Dead, because even if they sound terrible, they look great if you happen to have taken lots of LSD. So that's the only known applied use of psychedelic-induced synesthesia that I'm aware of as well, unfortunately. So here's another experience. So this is again on LSD. This is more of a kind of kinesthetic, somatic kind of response to the sound, but again induced by sound. The bass frequencies have rotated my hips, or felt like experiencing acceleration. The mid-range was an expansion of my flesh, and the high frequencies were twinkling that was popping above my head, but I was feeling the twinkling. So very much kind of felt sound. So these are kind of some examples of direct inducer concurrent relationships. A particular sensory induction relates to one other induced experience in another sense modality, but often the experiences with psychedelics can be much more complex. So not only are you kind of seeing the sound, you may also taste it, feel it, you've become it, etc. And so that can get quite complicated and often confusing for the experient, as demonstrated in the case of this person on ayahuasca, nevertheless. We decided to take this into the lab after doing our survey. We had some kind of good reason to suspect we could possibly induce experiences of synesthesia in the lab. The early research, experimental research in the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s had been very badly controlled, but it was kind of early science, so we figured we'd try and do it in a placebo-controlled, blind, randomized LSD controlled trial, which is very difficult to conduct until recently. Luckily, we piggybacked on a study they were doing at Imperial College, and a few of the participants reported having experiences of synesthesia, but we did try to experimentally test that. So we played them sounds, or they had to look at graphemes, and then they were shown a colour checker display, and they would pick the colour they felt was associated to that sound or that grapheme, and we repeated it again later in the day, hopefully when they'd forgotten what they'd picked, to see if it was consistent over time. And it turns out, well, I'm not going to go into the details of all these horrible graphs, but there was no consistency whatsoever. Thank you very much. So it seemed like, although people are reporting having these experiences, it's very transient, and it isn't consistent in the same way in which congenital lifelong synesthesia is. And there might be good reasons for that, because it's developmental as much as anything. People are only having a brief glimpse of a synesthetic experience rather than having a lifetime of it to consolidate these associations. So we figured trying to induce it in the lab temporarily is probably not a brilliant idea, but luckily, I would say for me at least, though not necessarily for them, in the course of doing the survey, some people reported that they had permanent synesthesia as a result. And I say some, like far less than 1%, maybe a couple of people. And then I was later contacted by a couple of other people who also felt that they hadn't had synesthesia before taking psychedelics, that usually always had an accidentally high dose of psychedelics, like not really paying very much attention to the dosage, and something happened and they would end up with what they believed to be permanent synesthesia. In fact, a lot of them didn't even understand what was going on, and it took me to kind of help explain it to them that they probably had induced acquired synesthesia, or at least it looked like congenital synesthesia. So we managed to get one of these people to volunteer to come into our lab. He had taken a very high dose of a psychedelic called 2CB. I can tell you more about that if you want, but needless to say, it's a potent psychedelic. He didn't have synesthesia before, and then afterwards he had sound colour, music colour, chord colour, synesthesia, so listening to sounds, induced colours. He also had colours would induce emotions as well, so he couldn't leave the house for 2 years because he was just terrified of walking past a sweet shop and all the personalities of all the kind of, the colourful things in there overwhelming him, etc. So we got him into the lab and we did some tests on him using a face colour Stroop test, whereby we first of all identified what particular colours were associated with particular emotional faces. They appear to be consistent for him, and so we then set up a computer paradigm whereby the colours would be presented, and then very quickly afterwards there would be the colour that either corresponded to that face for him or one that was incongruent with that face. And then we looked at his reaction times to say whether it was the same or different. And when we compared this to a control group, he showed all the classic signs of congenital synesthesia, in that he was much slower to respond, much slower to respond in the graph, to incongruent face colours, stimulants, and also made more errors as well. So this is a kind of behavioural measure to show that not only is his synesthesia seemingly consistent, but it also conforms to one of the other features of congenital synesthesia, is that it's automatic. It has this automaticity as well. It can't really help it. It interferes. If the colour is incongruent with the colour he associates with that face, it really stalls his response times. And then we, as a final study, I'm just going to round this up because I'm out of time, we also looked to do some TMS with him, transcranial magnetic stimulation. It looks like a slightly barbaric device, but you can place this on the occipital lobe at the back of the head and the visual cortex, and you stimulate the visual cortex mildly with an electrical current. And for everybody, at a certain point, you will begin to see phosphenes, like little kind of like glimmers of light in your visual field at a certain threshold. And the thresholds are different for everybody. But one of the theories underlying synesthesia is that people have higher excitability in their visual cortex if they have a kind of visual kind of synesthesia. So we wanted to test that idea. We looked at his cortical threshold in the visual cortex, for phosphines, and it turns out he wasn't any different from a control group for comparison. So that was a bit of a surprise. But nevertheless, just to pick up on this thread, the previous speaker mentioned aphantasia with people who have no visual mental imagery, and so the research in that area is increasingly interesting, and it seems to be pointing towards the direction that mental imagery isn't necessarily being kind of created or stimulated from the visual cortex, and actually they found that the ratio of excitability between the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, and the frontal cortex is indicative of the strength of visual mental imagery. So we're probably looking in the wrong place. That's pretty much it. I hope I was more or less on time. There's the references for our research. Thank you to my collaborators and participants, and thank you for being on the audience.
Thanks so much, David. Yes, right in the middle.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. I was told that the main difference between drug-induced synesthesia and inherited synesthesia is that with the drugs there is a missing repeatability. Is that true? Do you agree?
Yeah, so that's kind of what we found. You can induce it perhaps in a few people in a lab, but it isn't consistent, it isn't repeatable, you know. Like if you test them at the same time later in the same day, but later in the day whilst they're still feeling the experience of the drugs, it's very difficult to detect any consistency. They may pick one colour in the morning associated with a sound or a grapheme and a different colour in the afternoon. And the reason we think that is, it's not that drug-induced synesthesia is inherently different from congenital synesthesia, lifelong synesthesia. It's just with lifelong synesthesia, people consolidate those associations over long periods of time, over years potentially. You know, there's research to show that people with grapheme colour synesthesia often associate those colours with the fridge magnets they had on their fridge door. I've seen very much. I don't know, I'm not going to contest that too much, but it clearly is developmental. We're not born with colours associated to numbers and letters, for example. It's something that has to consolidate over time, and there's possibly some variability in the early stages of life. So, however, in the case of our participant who had like what seemed to be a permanent state of synesthesia after taking too much 2CB, he'd had it for 7 years when we brought him into the lab as an adult. He hadn't had it before that, and his synesthesia was consistent and was automatic, access to consciousness, all the rest of it. So in a few cases, it looks like, very rarely, people can acquire synesthesia through drug use, but it's quite exceptional.
No.
You use the word acquire now, but is it acquiring or unmasking? And then you just start paying attention. And the question is actually relating to the TMS with the phosphine threshold. If I understand correctly, you did that after you already found out the guy acquired synesthesia, but you don't have a baseline for the same person.
No, unfortunately not. We can't go back in time to before he had.
That would have been the best controls within the individual, especially for people who may have experienced LSD for the first time in your study.
Yeah.
Then you can see whether it's really opening doors in perception in a wider sense, that keeping them open, or it's just a temporary thing.
Thank you for your question, or your point. Yes, I mean, the thing is, we've only got 4 or 5 cases of people that we know of have seemingly got permanent drug-induced synesthesia. So they're not very common, and it's kind of impossible to predict necessarily who's going to take drugs and have permanent kind of synesthetic effects. It'd be great as a prospective study, but you'd probably have to get hundreds of thousands of people who are all about to take psychedelics, and then you maybe get a handful of them which end up with synesthesia, and you'd have to kind of get their baseline measures. So it's not really feasible unless you actually try and induce it in people in a permanent way, but that's not really ethically sound either. So it's problematic. However, it does differ. I mean, he didn't seem to have any congenital synesthesia, we interviewed his family and friends. They said he never reported it. He never reported it. His auntie seemingly had synesthesia, so it may have been, there's some suggestion it's partly inherited at least. So he may have had an underlying proclivity for it, but he didn't have any of the hallmark features of having synesthesia. That is the experience of it, the access to consciousness, the automaticity. And for him, when it happened, it was completely overwhelming. As for all our other case studies, they basically all had to go and hide away for a couple of years until they habituated to the experience.
But also brain trauma can also induce, like Jason Pettit with the blow to his head, Noisy wrote about, and there's also pandas, the disease, that also I knew someone who could induce maybe has induced synesthetic traits.
Yeah.
We'll hear about that in another talk. I'm not sure which day it is. Following on Noam's question, in the people who temporarily had synesthetic-like experiences, do you think you're unmasking something or inducing new connections?
Well, yes, I think in that, well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say.
And how would you find out?
But, what I think that perhaps, it's hard to say, but I will say that drug-induced synesthesia appears to be the same phenomena as congenital synesthesia. It's just very temporary and short-lived. But we still I don't know what the underlying causes or etiology of synesthesia are, and it may be multiple ways of developing synesthesia in the brain. It could be proximity, that doesn't hold up for all cases. It could be excitability. The thing with psychedelics is they also induce hyperconnectivity when you're experiencing them. So all these parts of the brain which aren't ordinarily communicating are suddenly in communication with each other temporarily. So that's probably the hyperconnectivity going on. And whether or not that is the kind of underlying nature of congenital synesthesia, I'm not sure, but I think that the phenomena is the same.
Okay. We're out of time, but Sean, that's the question?
I was just thinking to myself here that the phenomenon of congenital and drug-induced synesthesia might be the same as to what's going, or quite similar as to what's going on in the brain, but the experience would not be the same. And for me, that is still a key point, is that the experiences are quite different.
In what regards?
Well, that's very simple, right? A 30-year-old man taking LSD for the first time and having synesthetic experiences.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. A 30-year-old man with congenital synesthesia has had congenital synesthesia since he was aware of it since he was 5 years old. He has 25 years worth of reflection upon his current synesthesia.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree that the temporary experience is going to be very different to a lifelong experience of synesthesia. But in the cases of those who have then developed lifelong synesthesia from the point of taking drugs, that experience, once it's habituated, looks everything like congenital synesthesia. So yes, in the moment, you're just going to be overwhelmed and be like, oh wow, and it's not going to be consistent, it's not going to be automatic, and so it's going to be a different experience for the majority of people, yeah. And that's when it's a synesthesia-like experience as opposed to genuine synesthesia, long-term synesthesia. So in some ways, yeah, it's partly semantics, but I agree to some extent.
We're out of time. I'm going to defer to an organizer, Carol.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating report. I have a couple of questions and one observation. The question is, do you have any pictures, any drawings, any images made by people when they're under the influence?
Not on me at the minute, but yeah, I mean, there's plenty around, yeah.
Because the thing that I've noticed is people who are working from synaesthesia and people who are working from hallucinogens, in the hallucinogen imagery, something is missing. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something is definitely missing, so I'd like to see what you've got.
Yeah, absolutely. I've only got this one example, but that's quite stylized, so yeah. But thank you for that.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
David.